Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Echo Swinford. I am a PowerPoint MVP from Indianapolis, Indiana. I actually got my start in charting about 20 years ago when I was working for a medical education communications company, and my job was to make the physicians look good. And actually, I should say that is to make their charts look good. So I eventually became intimately familiar with Excel's charting capability. So because of that, I ended up learning quite a few tricks, and I have some tips for you for ways that you can actually make charts more effective. They're not difficult, they're tangible things that you can do and do very easily. So I thought I would share those with you today, because even though I am charting in PowerPoint, it's still using Excel under the hood. And these are things that you can use no matter what software you are working with. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is how we actually process information. And our brains process information through both visual channels and through audio channels. And you cannot process both at the same time. That's what confuses people. And in fact, there are studies that show that if you have a lot of text on a slide, or in a chart, I should say, but your audience is actually reading that information instead of listening to you. And so they actually recall less of your presentation if you have too many words. So like I said, that also goes for charts. If your audience is trying to wrap their heads around your chart and what it means, then they are not listening to you. The thing is, our brains are filtering all of that sensory information, and only a little bit of it actually stays in your short-term working memory. It's kind of like threading the eye of a needle. And because of this, it's actually better to feed your information in small bits rather than do just a huge data dump. Now, there are these things called pre-attentive attributes, and they are, as you might expect, attributes of the visual that your subconscious brain interprets instantly. So your audience will see a graphic and their brains are already working on it before you even get started talking. Their brains are parsing that information. But you can leverage that to your advantage. By using pre-attentive attributes, you can guide your audience and you can help tell your story step by step. Now, pre-attentive attributes are actually rooted in what we call Gestalt theory. Gestalt theory was developed in the 1920s by a group of psychologists who were studying perceptual organization. And what they were really trying to figure out was how your brain organizes information and how it perceives both the parts and the whole of an object. And what they figured out was that we subconsciously segregate and group all of the visual information in order to perceive it as a whole. So what they determined ultimately is that a very simple, well-defined object will communicate much more quickly than a very detailed object that has a hard to recognize contour. Now, there are more than 100 Gestalt principles, and some of them, the ones that I've shown here on this slide, these are especially relevant to data visualization in general and making effective charts. Now, this leads to those Gestalt principles, I should say. Those Gestalt principles lead to those pre-attentive attributes that I mentioned. And that leads to those visual cues that our brains start noticing and sorting out before you even realize it. So where am I going with this? I'm talking about Gestalt principles, I'm talking about pre-attentive processing, and you're all thinking, what is the point? This is all the stuff your brain is doing whenever you look at a graphic. And I want you to make no mistake. I want to be very clear about this. A chart is a graphic. It's a graphical representation of numbers. And if you do it right, you can help your audience quickly understand your numbers and your main point. So you hear a lot about storytelling, and that's what this is. You want them to understand your story. And if you use Gestalt principles and pre-attentive attributes, you will end up with a chart that is, as my friend Nolan Hayes says, glanceable rather than referenceable. And that is the overall goal. You want people to be able to understand your point at a glance rather than having to study this big, huge spreadsheet or a complex and confusing chart and then walk away with maybe even a completely different understanding than you might expect. I want you to think about your charts as billboards. I know that's really simplistic and I know that's easier said than done, but seriously, if you're looking at this, which one's going to make you want to eat more chicken? The takeaway is get to the point, and don't be afraid to tell your audience what that point is. That's very important. Tell them what the point is. Now on this slide, I've actually plotted the spreadsheet. And so you see this table over here on the right. You can think about this chart as your billboard. And when you compare that chart to the spreadsheet, you can see how that well-conceived chart really is more like a billboard. It gets your message across so much more effectively than just a sea of numbers. So I want to talk to you about what you need to do to make it happen. One reason you will find one chart more effective than another chart is because of something we call emphasis. And you can leverage those Gestalt principles that we just talked about and those pre-attentive attributes that we just talked about to emphasize the point that you want to emphasize. And what I always tell my students is when everything is bold, nothing is bold. And that's kind of what I want you to remember when we talk about emphasis, because when everything is bold, nothing is emphasized. Emphasis is really more about contrast. And if you look at this, and if I were to ask you which slide is more compelling, well, you would obviously say the one on the right with the big black block and the big white text. And that is more compelling because of contrast. There's a person named Robin Williams who wrote a book called The Non-Designer's Design Book, and she says, by its very nature, contrast calls attention to itself. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to create contrast, so you are calling attention to the part of the chart that you want people to notice and to understand. So you need to create contrast to create emphasis. So this ad, I usually do a little exercise here, and I'm not actually sure if there's a way for me to see Q&A and chat very easily with Teams. So I'm going to just talk you through this. What I would normally do is, and you can write this down on a sheet of paper right in front of you, like, what do you look at first when you look at this ad? Do you look at this big bold text? Do you look at the tennis shoe? Do you look at the red swoop up in the corner? Do you look at all the tiny little text? Do you look at the little red lines? What do you look at? Most people will look at either this big, large text up here in the corner, or they will look at this huge tennis shoe that's right in the middle. And that's what contrast is about, and that's what emphasis is about. Remember, creating emphasis is really about creating contrast. And magazine ads in general are really great for using all of these different ways to create contrast. Contrast can be size, it can be shape, it can be color, it can be positioning, it can be so many different things, and that's what makes it kind of difficult. But I would say that size and color are two of your most effective strategies for creating emphasis in charts. What you're doing when you're creating that emphasis is you're also creating a hierarchy. In this case, we know that that big, bold text is what you're supposed to read first. Even if you look at the shoe first, you're going to read that big, huge, bold text first. That is the most important thing, and you know the name of this shoe immediately when you look at this slide, because they've created contrast using that size and that boldness. Here's another example. What do you look at first when you look at this ad? Now think about it. This one is not quite as clear cut as the tennis shoe. It's maybe a little more muddled than that really nice, clean shoe ad. And it's not as easy to tell here maybe what you're supposed to look at. However, you should know that that text, that big, all caps, white, bold text that is on that very dark background, that is the most contrasted place in this ad. And so that should be pretty obvious that that's what you're supposed to look at. And even if it's not at the top of the ad, it is still what you're supposed to look at. There's this whole school of study around reading order. And then, you know, sometimes you read in Z, some theories say you read in Z, some say you read in T. There are a lot of different ways that we read things. And a really good designer can lead your eye through an ad or through a piece of paper or a flyer. Think about that. But you can help direct your audience by taking some of those cues from those designers. And in this case, you know that what you're supposed to look at is, you know, we're introducing the all-new BMW 7 Series. I mean, that's what this is all about. We are introducing a new car. So even though that car is big and bold and right in the middle, you're still looking at that text, probably, if not first, very, very close after you look at the car. So you're seeing that and you know what the point is because you created hierarchy using contrast and using emphasis. Like I said, I think that color and size are probably your two strongest ways to create emphasis in charts. I would call saturation a variation on color. It's where we make something more saturated. You'll see that a lot in demographic maps, chloroplast, things like that, where you know the more dense the data, the more dense the color, basically. So whatever is important, that's what you're going to look at. That's what's contrasted. That's what you darken. And that's what you emphasize. So you are actually creating that emphasis. When you are creating emphasis, one thing you need to think about and one thing you need to consider is what is in the background and what is in the foreground. Background and foreground information can be really, really important because anything that's in the background should really drop out and anything that's in the foreground should really stand out. And that's where a lot of times people go wrong, and not necessarily as much as they used to. Like, I don't see charts like this very often anymore. I used to see them all the time, but it's actually really instructive. And this chart actually reminds me of my mom's couch, which I know sounds really, really weird, but I'm going to, let me tell you about this. My mom, this is my mom's couch as a chart story. My mom got this new couch and it's this really pretty red couch. And I walked in one day to her house and there were about a million gazillion pillows hanging out all over this couch. And it just looked like this huge hulk in the end of one room. And I'm like, Mom, dude, what are you doing? What is up with these pillows? And she said, you know, I just felt like this couch was a little too big for the space. So I'm trying to hide it with the pillows. I kept thinking if I put more on there, I'm like, let's try this. Let's try stripping all of these things off. Let's take off the throw rugs. Let's take off the pillows. Let's just strip it down to the bare basics. And so we stripped everything off and it looked fantastic. It actually wasn't too big for the space, but it looked bigger and hulkier because she kept throwing all these pillows on. So this is my mom's bold couch. It's like somebody doesn't know how to create emphasis, so they keep piling things on and making lines thicker and darker and bolder, and you just don't know where to look. So this is the perfect example of when I said everything is bold, nothing is bold. This is the example. You don't know what to look at when you're looking at this chart because nobody knew how to create emphasis. Help your audience. Remove all that extra stuff so they can focus on what's important. And I hope that it's really, really easy to see the difference between this chart and this chart, and you immediately know what you want to look at. You're not fighting to figure out what's a trend line and what's an actual data point. You're not fighting through all those grid lines. You don't have all those crazy data markers. Help your audience. Trim out that stuff. You should also consider color. Go easy on the color. You already know, in this case, this chart on the left, you know that all of those individual bars represent different countries. And when you vary all of the colors like that, it visually separates them because it makes them all look different than one another. So that pre-attentive attribute, your brain is wondering, well, what's different here? What am I supposed to be noticing about this? What you want to do here is you want to encourage people to compare the countries as a whole and to see that ranking pattern that they form as a whole. So it's really better if the colors are alike and they look alike here because it puts them all on equal footing, if you will. And your brain is not trying to figure out what is different from one than the other. It processes it as a whole better. And if you want to take it a step further, you could just emphasize that one point. And so this would be an example of using either that color or the saturation, however you want to term it, but it does take it that step further. In that last chart, you know exactly what it is you're supposed to be looking at and focusing on. You want to look at Australia there. You're not looking at France, you're not looking at UK, you're looking at Australia. And you can see how much easier it is to see what's important in that third chart than it is in the first, right? Yeah, it makes a difference. Color choices make a difference. The thing is that too much color is very visually overwhelming and it makes your eyes tired. If you use all of this color gratuitously, you undermine its ability to be used to make things stand out. So what you see here is in this chart on the right where we've toned back all of the other color and we've put those 2 red dots on there. Those red alerts really stand out in that chart on the right because they're contrasted with those very neutral grays. On the left, there's so much color and it's meaningless color at this point. You can't really distinguish one thing from another. So be careful with your color. The next thing that you can think about, in addition to emphasis, is chart junk. And we've touched on this briefly with some of the things I covered there, but chart junk is an important thing to know about. And I think it's kind of inherent in the description, but this is what chart junk is. When you have too much stuff on that slide, your brain can't process it all, just like my mom's couch slide. Your brain doesn't have a way of knowing what's important. And so there it is, that when everything is bold, nothing is bold. So do you guys know who Edward Tufte is? He is, I would consider him probably the godfather of data visualization. He was doing data viz long before anyone else really was focused on it. But he coined the term chart junk, and he defines chart junk as anything that doesn't help in understanding. So if it doesn't help your understanding, it's chart junk and you can get rid of it. If you Google chart junk, these are some of the examples that come up. And I have to emphasize, I do not see chart junk quite this extreme these days. I mean, oh my gosh, even just 10 years ago, you would see this stuff all of the time. And I don't see that as often, but it is still helpful to look at these extreme examples. Now, what would you consider chart junk here? Now, I know that you guys, most of this stuff is obvious, right? Bananas, I mean, come on, that chart is bananas. It's insane. But some of these things, like the extra legend, there's an extra legend on that chart on the bottom right, and it says % of sales. That is also chart junk, because that could actually be a chart title. It could be a slide title. I mean, there is one series in that chart, you guys. You do not need a legend. You can explain what that is without adding a legend down there for one series. Now, again, these are extreme examples, but let's look at something that's not so extreme. Because I see charts like this all the time. And I don't know about you, but this is what my clients give me. And they think that this is a pretty good chart. And it's not the worst thing I've ever seen, but it could be so much better. And even some of the Excel default charts, I think that they could be so much better, especially those quick styles that we have. They are the style gallery. Some of those are a little over the top. But let's look at this one. What could we remove? Now remember, chart junk is anything that doesn't help in understanding. So one of the things that you could remove, we just talked about this a second ago, you could remove the color on the bars, because that's not really helping your understanding, especially if you want to look at this as a whole. You could also remove the background fill on this plot area right here. There's no need to have that light gray background fill. And also all of the shadows. You have a shadow on the legend over here. You have a shadow behind the plot area. You have all of these shadows. You have this weird outline on the plot area as well. One thing I will tell you about shadows, if you are going to put a shadow on a chart, and I am not completely opposed to shadows, like we have shadows on things on PowerPoint slides all the time. But if you're going to add a shadow, make it one shadow. Like, don't have, in this case, the legend has a shadow that's pointing to the lower right, and the plot area has a shadow that looks like it's pointing all the way around. It's like all the way around the edges. So what you want to make sure is you use one light source per chart. Let's put it that way. I always tell people one light source per slide. Same thing, one light source per chart. Don't have all kinds of weird shadows like that. So those are some of those things that you can get rid of. You can also, you'll see over here that we have average income in 2 different places. You don't need to have everything labeled like that. You can maybe get rid of that axis label because this is average income and it's in dollars or pounds or whatever kind of currency you've listed there. And while you're thinking about that, you might want to think about using number formats to get rid of some of those extra zeros in the axis, because all they do is take up room and add lots and lots of visual clutter. And then again, that legend is completely redundant. You have those labels at the bottom, you have the category labels at the bottom on the axis, you don't need a legend as well. And you don't need the axis label that says months. I mean, I think it's obvious, January, February, March, those are months. Hello, duh. So think about what you can remove and how you can streamline and how you can simplify. And it sounds very, what do I want to say? It sounds very common sense, and it is very common sense. But the thing is, a lot of times people don't think about it until someone points it out. And so now that I've pointed it out, hopefully you'll think about doing these things. So we can get pretty easily from this slide and this chart junk look to something very, very simple and streamlined like this. And again, we know what we want to look at for emphasis, and we've cleared out all that extra stuff. Look, it's almost like you can breathe. You can look at it and you can see what's important. If you want to take it a step further, you could even get rid of the axis and you could go with direct data labels for those columns. And you don't have to do both. Again, if you have an axis here, you don't necessarily need data labels, and if you have data labels, you don't need the axis. So you're going from lots to very, very little, lots of chart jump to something very clean and streamlined, and something that tells the story immediately. And it's not really that difficult. It's just about stripping out all that extraneous stuff. You just have to think about what it is you want to emphasize and then remove all of the clutter surrounding it. Let's spend a minute on labeling and titling. I was just talking about data labels, so it's appropriate to discuss those here because this stuff always comes up as well. And this is the kind of thing that can trip us up also, and it will make a huge difference with your charts. Do not make your audience bounce back and forth between the chart and the legend. This type of thing takes a lot of mental gymnastics. It takes a lot of, I don't know, brain cycles, I guess, but it also takes time. And it's not time that you're maybe measuring because it's that pre-attentive attribute thing, but your audience is sitting here thinking about this and bouncing back and forth and trying to understand that chart. And while they're doing that, they are not listening to you. Trust me, they're not paying any attention. Don't make them work. Don't make them work for it any more than you have to. Keep everything as simple as you can. So if you can direct label something, it will help. Now, even if you put the numbers in the chart like I have on the left, I still have that legend up here. So you're still doing that mental gymnastics and bouncing back and forth. But if you look at the chart on the right, I hope that you can see how much easier it is to just immediately, at a glance, be able to look and see what each of those chart slices represents. Because it's labeled, it's right there, you don't have to think. You can just look at it, understand, and move on. And now you're listening to me talk about it and talk about my story about that data rather than trying to figure it out. When you're labeling a pie chart and even a column chart, inside and outside labels, both are fine. People ask that all the time. You can combine them if you need to. You can have some labels inside and some labels outside if you need to, because they fit better that way. That's okay. Don't get too hung up on that kind of thing, but definitely go with direct labels if you can. Same thing goes for columns, for lines, all kinds of things. I would say that a legend isn't actually any better on the right. A lot of times people will say, well, maybe if I put it over here on the right by the end of the lines, then it will be easier. But in this case, I would say that this is actually even harder because the legend is out of order from the last point. The legend is in the order of the first points over there. So top to bottom, it doesn't really match up with those lines, and it's a little mind-bending. So your audience is sitting there trying to figure that out, whether they realize it or not. They really are. They're working hard to try to understand what's going on there because it doesn't match up exactly. Remember threading the needle? If your audience is focused on trying to interpret your chart, not listening to you. So what we suggest, rather than labeling like on the left, is that you go with, rather than a legend like on the left, we suggest that you go with direct labeling like you see on the right here. It is so much easier and so much faster to read, and this helps you get to that glanceability. You know exactly what each line is, you don't have to think about it. Don't make me think, at least not any more than I have to. Direct labeling also lets you gray out what you don't want to emphasize. So that helps you get back to all of those Gestalt principles and those pre-attentive attributes. And here we've leveraged those. So your audience knows at a glance what's important without even thinking about it. Immediately, there's no question. Also, don't forget your chart titles. Sometimes if you're doing a presentation or you're presenting your data, especially, you could even just forego the chart title and you could put the information in the slide title. So if you're actually presenting in PowerPoint, you don't have to have chart titles. Put it up there in the slide title. Use subtitles in a smaller font if you need to add a lot more information. But this is really taking a page from a consultant's book. When consultants make presentations, the charts and the slide titles are always written with a takeaway. So their thing is, what does it matter? Why is this important? What's in it for me? What's the point? Why should I care? And that's what they want to see in that chart title. They want some kind of informational thing, not just something like annual sales. Because what would you say the point is for this chart? If someone emailed you this chart, like, what's the story on this? Annual sales, so what? Like, what am I supposed to think? If I receive this, like, what, sales are seasonal? Q1 sales sucked? Sales skyrocketed in the fourth quarter? We're on a roll, we're on a roller coaster. Like, what's the takeaway here? Don't leave your audience hanging. Tell them what the point is. Don't be afraid to say that. Use those McKinsey style, consultant style titles if you need to. And then also, this goes with labeling as well, but sorting your data is really, really helpful for parsing information much more easily. If you look at this column chart or this column of columns down the left, it's really hard to tell. I mean, you can tell what's first, sure, but second and third, you can't really judge it. But if you sort your data, it's a lot easier to see top to bottom and to tell like that. So sorting also helps your audience parse more quickly. Again, pre-attentive attributes. Always questions about what kind of chart do I use. So I thought I would spend a couple of minutes showing you some different options and some different things to think about when you're choosing your chart types. Now here we have the same data displayed two different ways. Which chart displays the shape of change through time more clearly? Well, obviously the one on the right, the line chart. I mean, bars work really well for comparing individual values to one another, but lines show the shape of change through time. And so which do you use? It depends on the story you're trying to tell, but it's something that you should consider when you're trying to work on your charts and make them much more visible and effective. Figure out what it is your story is, and then select the type of chart to help show that off. A combination chart shows data a little differently as well. Same data, much different look. And then here's another option. In this case, that data marker from this line chart here, the data marker has been changed to a dash, and we increased the size to, I don't know, 40 or 50 or something to make it really thick and a little bit wider than the bar. It's a variation on that combo chart, and it's yet another way to tell your same story. But I think that this one really helps emphasize those monthly forecasts, especially, month by month. Also, just because it equals 100% does not mean it has to be a pie chart. People go to pie charts, they see 100% and they go to a pie immediately. This is way too many slices for a pie, but I see this kind of thing all the time. And it's just not as effective as it could be. There are so many different options that you can use for pie charts. I mean, doesn't this help you see the data better? It's the exact same data, but you can compare it much more effectively than you can if all of that data is in a pie. How about something like this stacked column? You can move it out like that, and you can still get the sense of this is the whole data set, and here are all of the pieces. Or I guess that's a stacked bar. This one's a stacked column. This is yet another option. But what you're seeing are various different options for pies. You could use tree maps. You can use all kinds of things. Ann K. Emery, in case you don't know who Ann K. Emery is, Ann K. Emery has she has a newsletter and a blog, and she is a data viz specialist. She runs a Depict Data Studio, and what I like about her is when she sends out her newsletter and when she does her blog posts, she will look back at a chart that she did a few years ago and she'll be like, what was I thinking? And she'll walk you through a makeover of her chart, and she will talk about why she made certain decisions. And I find it super, super instructive. So you can always go to head to depictdatastudio.com and you can sign up for the newsletter there, or you can just Google Ann K. Emery. But I really recommend her stuff if you're interested in this kind of thing. She has some rules for pie charts. And her rules are that, well, you can see them. They're well formatted. So what that means is no 3D, no exploding slices, no weird leader lines, no legends. Make a good pie chart. And then you should also use nominal variables. Ordinal variables, which is like survey data or like first, second, third. Those do not belong in a pie chart. And I'm going to show you some of these examples. Add to 100%. I mean, we all know that, but sometimes somebody will delete a category that says other or something like that. And so they'll forget to recalculate the new percentages and the pie doesn't add up. Or sometimes you get rounding errors. Rounding errors will completely derail your presentation. So make sure that your pie adds to 100%. It should also contain positive numbers. I personally have never seen a pie with negative numbers, but apparently it happens sometimes. People do weird things. Don't add negative numbers into your pies if you're going to use a pie. And a pie should display a single point in time. I'll show you a couple of examples of these, but if you're going to do a time series, a pie chart or a series of pie charts is not the way to go. You also want to only have 2 or 3 slices. 4 is really pushing it. 5 is on the very outskirts and very rarely acceptable, but really just, 2 or 3 slices tops. And then you want to display those pies individually. And this kind of goes back to the time series, but it's really difficult to compare pies. So you want to just do one pie. You trust me, you can't compare them. I'll show you. Now, I would also add that they should start at 12 o'clock. So your 0 point should be up here at 12 and that they should be sorted clockwise, largest to smallest, because that's how we parse that data quickly. And it goes back to those Gestalt principles and pre-attentive attributes. No exploding pies. There's that first one. Make sure your pies are well formatted. This is not helping. This is kind of chart junk. The whole explosion, I would call that chart junk because it is not helping you understand. You have a legend here. So make sure your pies are well formatted if you're going to use them. Don't use too many slices, all of that stuff we just discussed. They should add to 100% and they should display nominal variables. Now this happens actually a lot. I see this a lot in the news. That's why I show these, because this happens in the wild all the time. But especially if survey takers, somebody who's taken a survey can select more than one answer, a pie chart is not the kind of chart you want to use to display that data, because it will not add to 100% and you'll end up with crazy things like this that make no sense whatsoever. And every news organization is guilty of it, I promise you. You want to think about your variables, ordinal, sequential variables. They have a natural order, first, second, third. I mean, think about responses to a survey. It goes from strongly agree to disagree to strongly disagree. It's an order, it's a progression. If you have that kind of data, or if you have age ranges or things like that, other groupings, you want to use stack columns or maybe columns and bar charts for those instead of pies. So strongly agree, agree, disagree, not good for a pie. You don't see that kind of progression so well. Also, like I said, no multiple pies. It is very, very difficult to compare one pie to another. Can you compare these? I find this extremely difficult. Something like this would be so much more better. Would be so much better and so much more effective. It is way better to do a series of column charts or stacked columns because you can compare those so much more easily than you can one pie to another. So don't fall into that trap of just because it's 100%, don't fall into that trap of multiple pies. You might also consider slope charts. Now, Edward Tufte, talked about him a couple of minutes ago, he actually invented slope charts. These are a fairly new type of chart, and I'm starting to see them more and more in the wild, actually, and I really, really like them. They make it very easy to compare a beginning point and an end point for multiple products or multiple companies, or so you see a time frame in there. You can compare one company to another. I think that they're really, really interesting and very, very effective in most cases. Now I'm going to show you the same data as pies. It's a lot more difficult. And it's actually maybe impossible to see that change over time, don't you think? Like comparing 2008 to 2018 for each of these groups of these pairs of pies, it's almost impossible as far as I'm concerned. I think it's very difficult. And then if you look at these side by side, think about this. The smaller number here is usually better. So look at the expat survey. Like it looks like Singapore is doing worse. If you look in the pies, it looks like it's doing worse because smaller number is better. But if you look at the slope graph, you can see that it just skyrocketed up there and it's so much more. I mean, it's doing so much better, not worse. And you see that with the slope chart. You don't see that with the pie. So there are a lot of problems with the pies compared to the slopes. So those are just things that you can consider when you're looking at different kinds of charts to help display that type of data. I really like some slope charts. Those are pretty cool. Here's another example. This is two pies, two donuts, and a donut chart is essentially a pie with a white circle in the middle. People like them because they're a little sexy. They can put a little call to action or a little label or something in the middle. There's a little more white space, so they're kind of trendy, but essentially a donut is a pie. There's not really much difference there. You cannot compare pies. You cannot compare donuts. And I found this one on Excel MVP John Peltier's site. I don't know, a couple of years ago, I think. This was actually published in The Economist magazine, and I honestly cannot even believe that it made it to a publication because it is just so bad. You just absolutely simply cannot compare pies and donuts like this. Now, if you look at this spreadsheet, you can see Asia Pacific, you can see the data. And you can tell that Asia Pacific just went like this and Western Europe just plummeted. But I challenge you to see that in these donut charts. You cannot see that kind of thing at all. You can't, that data, those charts do not help anything there. No understanding, no extra information, no emphasis, nothing. But if you go with something like a slope chart, here's that very same data, and now you can immediately compare each country in 2007 and 2011, and you see Asia Pacific just skyrocketing, and you see Western Europe just plummeting. So it makes a huge difference there. Something like this can show that data so much more effectively than something like this. I'm shocked that that made it to a publication. It just doesn't make sense. So you're not helping your users. Remember, it's about helping your users, helping them parse that information so they're not trying to figure out what's happening in the chart and they can hear you talk about what you want them to know about those charts. Okay, remember this? This column chart is a little bit crowded. It's kind of squeezed in and it is a bit crowded. A couple of different kinds of charts that you can consider. I showed you this as an option. It's a combo chart, you know, a line and a column. I also showed you this as an option with, it's a variation on a column and a line. Some people call them a bullet chart. You basically have a target a lot of times. And this one really emphasizes those forecast numbers. We talked about that. So one kind of a bullet chart. Well, here's another one. This is another option. And this is another variation on what we call a bullet chart. And in this case, you see those forecasted numbers in the back as a column. So it's just the same information that's right here, it's just overlaid like that, which is really nice, and it's a good way to see the actuals versus the forecasts, and without it being too crowded, so you can parse that data pretty quickly. And it's not so different from a typical column that it really takes a lot of extra mental energy. I think we'll start seeing these more and more often also, because they are very effective, I think. Now, when you create a bullet chart in Excel, I do want to mention this because this is something that is not super intuitive, but you have to plot one of these series on a secondary axis so you can actually overlap them that way. Now, the data that you want on top is what gets plotted on the secondary axis. Usually it's going to be your actuals and then like your forecast or your goals or something like that would be in the back. But whatever you want on top, plot that on a secondary axis. And then you have to change the gap width to make the one in the back thicker and the one in the front skinnier. So change the gap width on those two series. And then you just make sure that the axes are the same. But the big key right there, honestly, is to plot one on a secondary axis. And that's not super intuitive, so I like to make sure that I show people those when I am showing bullet charts because I know it will throw people off. It's my little tip for you. And that, my friends, is what I wanted to tell you about today. Now, I want you to remember the most important thing that will help you make an effective chart is knowing the point you're trying to make. That helps you determine what it is you need to emphasize in order to help the audience. And I can't actually help you figure out the story of your data, but I do hope that I've helped you learn some specific techniques that you can use to make your charts more effective. And with that, I will switch over so I can see Q&A. But first, I do want to give you the evaluation QR code and link if you want to note this down. And I think that you guys have been posting links to the evaluations in the Q&A and in the chat. So grab that. And then also don't forget that the Excel team needs research participants. And I think you've seen some links and things for this as well. Thought I would throw it up there for you. Okay.
You finished then, Echo? Is that what you're trying to signal to me?
I'm finished. I am finished. I will stop sharing.
No, you might as well keep sharing if you like. Or we'll just leave your lovely webcam up there to answer questions. If you're up for that.
Okay. I can keep sharing. Let me just do that. Here.
Awesome.
Here's the Excel. Here's the here's the evaluations. And let me see if I can get Teams to come up so I can actually see some questions.
Well, that's
there
right.
We go.
Either way, I can read out some questions for you. First of all, I just want to say it's great to see you again. It's been a while. So.
Yes.
I'll start off with a couple of comments that Ingeborg made. So I'm not sure if you've met Ingeborg,
yes.
the GP from New Zealand. First of all, a comment that she made was that in New Zealand, horizontal bar chart sorting is a little bit different because regions are often sorted north to south rather than alpha or by values. And so you need to know where you live geographically. And so it makes a lot of sense to Kiwis, but it's a bit hard to grasp for everyone else.
Well, no, and that's a really good point. With an international audience, I probably should have focused on that a little bit more. I did try to hit a few different things in there, but yes, do know your audience, and that's one thing that we talk about with presentations in general, and that goes for presenting your data also, is know your audience, know what's important to them, know their level of understanding about the subject, like are they coming in completely green, do they actually have some sense for it, that type of thing. But that would definitely go for that. So if I'm presenting in New Zealand, I'm going to have to remember about sorting data. Actually, I'm going to run my presentation by Ingeborg first is what I'm going to do.
Well, that notion of knowing what your audience is thinking in the context leads us nicely onto Ingeborg's first question, which was that, yes, I understand the principles of good charts. Many bosses, however, don't have time to learn the good data viz, and they demand the bad pie charts and the charts that show all the company data on one slide. How do you handle situations like that?
That is an excellent question, and I don't have a perfect answer for you. I can tell you that I know that when I worked with the physicians, so I started at a med ed company. I started working for them in 1997. And so I was using PowerPoint 95 and Excel 95, and so MS Graph, or the old MS Graph and the old 3D charts and all of that. And I would try to, even back then, I would try to lose the y-axis, the value axis, and they were not having it. Those physicians like their axes. So I started dropping off the extra numbers, and I'd put K on, or I'd put currency on, and we'd do labeling like that. And I did what I could to trim down those axes, but I never did win that battle, is what I'm saying. Sometimes you will not win the battle, and sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. I mean, I'm not completely unrealistic. What I often do, though, and what I suggest to my data viz students who ask the same kind of question, because I get it, bosses, they don't have time, they don't care. But a lot of times what I would do for my physicians and for my clients is I will give them what they've asked for, and then I will give them what I want them to show. And I will show them that before and after. And so I'll give them, here's option 1, here's option 2. And a lot of times they choose option 2. And I'm really glad for that, because sometimes they do get it. If you can just show them and present it to them like that, sometimes they get it. Pick your battles, I think, is my answer. And try to show before and after if you can. Yeah.
No, that's definitely a good approach to take. The Q&A is quiet at the moment, so I'm just reminding folks that you can drop a message into the Q&A section, and Echo will try and answer it for you if we can. Yep.
And if not, I mean, hey, no reason to take up all your time. We're happy to give you 10 minutes back in your day, no problem.
I was going to say, everyone's going to hang around for the next presentation anyway, right? We don't want them to go too far away.
We can just do a chit chat, right? Yeah.
That's exactly.
We can just chat. How have you been?
That's what we did. I was going to say yesterday, but it was yesterday for me. It was earlier today for a lot of other people in the stream. But we had a short video, so someone recorded a 20-minute video to fill up our space, and so we basically had I think there was 3 or 4 of us MVPs who were online at the time, sitting in the presentation lounge, and a couple of other MVPs who were in chat quickly jumped on board as well. And we just had a bit of an Ask Me Anything type panel. Which was great.
Fun. That's always really fun. I did so a few years ago, as you might remember, and maybe some of the people on the line know, I started the Presentation Guild, which is a trade organization to advocate for those of us in the presentation industry. We're trying to, give ourselves credibility and legitimize our profession and all of that. But we set up some certifications. We've got a certification test, and so I did a boot camp for the certification over the last couple of weeks. And we've had some time like that in the last 5 or 10 minutes of class every day. We all drop out, and we're in Zoom, but we're in the Brady Bunch view, the meeting view, and so we can all see each other and chit chat a little bit. And what a great group! It's really fun to just sit down and be able to geek out with about your favorite software with a small group of people. So that's actually really cool that you were able to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well, you're getting a lot of good feedback. Everyone's saying it's a great session, excellent presentation. So thank you very much for presenting. I mean, much as saving everyone else 10 minutes, I don't want to take up an extra 10 minutes of your time. So
no worries.
If you've got no other questions, if you're happy to hang around for a bit longer, just to answer any questions that come up in the Q&A, that'd be great. If people are watching a bit delayed. But otherwise, we might as well wrap up the session here. Again, thank you, Echo. Love your presentations as always. And we'll look forward to you presenting next time.
Thanks for having me, everybody. Looking forward to it. It's good to see you, talk to you.
All righty.
Shut up now. I'll keep an eye on chat.
Thanks. Let me take back the screen sharing. We'll put this live. There we go. So for everyone who is hanging around, we are finally up to our last session of our giant 55-hour stream. So this final session is a presenter from Microsoft, Harish Menon, who is running a session on Excel and Power Automate. I know a lot of people have been making comments in some of the other sessions wondering when Power Automate would get featured. So if that's the case, this is the session for you. We'll be starting at 11 p.m. UTC/GMT, pretty much on the dot. So go off, grab a cup of tea, coffee, drink, whatever you like. For some people, it might be a midnight snack. For me, it might be breakfast. And we will see you at the turn of the hour.